Dr. Ayanna Morgan, a respected black surgeon, faces relentless racism and corruption when she moves to a small town to establish a health center for underserved communities. Despite her credentials, she's met with microaggressions, sabotage, and overt hostility, led by a corrupt police officer and a greedy developer conspiring to maintain their control. The story unfolds with shocking injustices, exposing the systemic racism and abuse of power deeply rooted in the town. Ayanna's fight for justice becomes a tense, emotional battle against a system determined to silence her, highlighting the infuriating realities of racism in America. The night was eerily quiet, the hum of the small town settling into the rhythm of crickets and distant car engines. Beneath the flickering streetlight stood Adrian Bennett, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his black overcoat. The world around him was still, but his mind churned with a storm of uncertainty. Adrian wasn't supposed to be there, not in Maplewood, a town he had vowed never to return to. Yet here he was, pulled back by the kind of call you can't ignore. A message from his younger sister Rachel. "Come home, it's Mom." Rachel's words had been heavy with something Adrian couldn't place, a mix of fear and urgency that now weighed him down as he stared at the modest house he had grown up in. The shutters hung slightly ajar, and the paint on the door had begun to chip. Everything looked the same, but Adrian knew better. Beneath the surface, something had shifted. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the yard, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He knocked twice, the sound hollow against the wooden frame. The door swung open, revealing Rachel's pale face. Her eyes darted nervously behind him before she whispered, "You came." "What's going on, Rachel?" Adrian asked, stepping inside. The air inside the house felt thick, suffocating. The silence stretched as Rachel hesitated. "It's Mom," she began, her voice trembling. "They're accusing her, Adrian. They're saying she—" Rachel choked on the words, her tears spilling over. "Accusing her of what?" Adrian's voice sharpened. "Of stealing," Rachel said, barely above a whisper. "They're saying she embezzled from the clinic." The words hit Adrian like a freight train. Their mother, Eleanor Bennett, was the most principled person he knew. She had spent decades running the Maplewood Free Clinic, caring for people no one else would. Stealing it was impossible. "I'm not letting this happen," Adrian said, his voice firm. Rachel grabbed his arm. "You don't understand, it's not just the accusation, the police. They came. They took her, Adrian. She faltered, and Adrian's blood ran cold. "They what?" he demanded. "They dragged her out of the clinic in handcuffs," Rachel whispered, her face pale. "They made it a spectacle everyone saw." Adrian's jaw clenched, a fire igniting in his chest. "Where is she now?" "At the station," Rachel said. "But Adrian, the officer in charge, it's Grant, Officer Grant." Adrian froze. The name brought back memories he had worked hard to bury. Memories of a man who had made it his mission to make life unbearable for anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. Officer Grant had been waiting for a reason to crush their family, and now he had one. Adrian nodded slowly, the calmness in his voice masking the storm inside him. "Then we start there." The courthouse steps gleamed under the morning sun, their polished marble catching the light like a beacon of justice. At least, that's how they were meant to look. To Dr. Ayanna Morgan, they were simply a facade, a stark contrast to the weight of bias and prejudice that often walked through the doors behind them. Ayanna adjusted the strap of her leather satchel and smoothed the front of her beige trench coat. The crisp fall air carried a sharp edge, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were elsewhere, circling back to the case that had brought her to this small town. Greenwood, a place that seemed to pride itself on its insular traditions and whispered hierarchies. At 42, Ayanna had built a career that defied expectations. A celebrated surgeon and philanthropist, she had founded the Morgan Health Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to bringing cutting-edge medical care to underserved communities. Her accomplishments had earned her accolades and invitations to galas, but Ayanna had never been one for ostentation. She still wore the same understated gold watch her mother had given her after medical school, its band slightly worn but polished to perfection. Today, as she ascended the steps of Greenwood Courthouse, she felt its weight on her wrist, a reminder of the roots she had promised never to forget. Inside, the courthouse lobby was a stark contrast to its grand exterior. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly, their harsh glow accentuating the scuffed linoleum floor and peeling paint on the walls. A cluster of people waited by the metal detector, their murmured conversations blending into a low hum. Ayanna's heels clicked softly as she approached the security checkpoint. The guard, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a badge that read, Officer J. Grayson, barely glanced up as she placed her satchel on the conveyor belt. "Empty your pockets," he barked, his tone curt. Ayanna complied, placing her phone and keys in the plastic tray. She stepped through the metal detector, her movements calm and deliberate. The machine beeped, and Grayson frowned. "Step back," he said, waving her through again. The beep sounded again. "It's the watch," Ayanna said, her voice even. Grayson's eyes flicked to her wrist, narrowing slightly. "Take it off." She hesitated, her fingers brushing the watch's clasp. "It's just a basic—" "I said take it off," he snapped, louder this time. Several heads turned, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Ayanna caught the way one of them lingered on her, a look she had seen too many times before. A mix of suspicion and something colder. Silently, she unclasped the watch and placed it in the tray. The metal detector stayed silent on her third pass. Grayson retrieved the tray, holding up the watch as if inspecting it for contraband. Ayanna forced herself to remain still, her expression neutral. "You here for jury duty?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "No," she replied. "I'm here as an expert witness." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Expert, huh? What kind?" "Medical," Ayanna said. "I'm testifying on behalf of the plaintiff in the Carter v. Landry case." Grayson's jaw tightened, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. Greenwood was small enough that everyone knew about the lawsuit. Charles Carter, a young black man, had accused a prominent local contractor of racial discrimination and unsafe labor practices. It was a case that had sparked quiet outrage in some corners of the town and defensive indignation in others. "Figures," Grayson muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Ayanna to catch. He handed her watch back without meeting her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her tone measured. She slid the watch onto her wrist, its familiar weight grounding her as she moved past the checkpoint. The courtroom was small, its wooden benches worn smooth by years of use. Ayanna chose a seat near the front, her presence drawing a few curious glances. She was used to the scrutiny. Her dark skin and poised demeanor often seemed to puzzle people who couldn't reconcile her authority with their assumptions. She had learned long ago to meet those stares with quiet confidence, letting her actions speak louder than words. The murmurs in the room hushed as the doors opened, and Judge Marilyn Spencer entered. Ayanna watched as the plaintiff's attorney, a young woman with determined eyes named Layla Harris, began organizing her notes. Layla had been the one to invite Ayanna to testify, her voice steady, but tinged with urgency during their first call. "This case is going to be tough," Layla had warned, "but your testimony could make all the difference." Ayanna had agreed without hesitation. She had reviewed the medical records, the injuries sustained by Charles Carter, when a scaffolding collapsed due to shoddy construction. She knew the truth was on their side, but truth alone wasn't always enough in places like Greenwood. As the court filled, Ayanna's attention drifted to the defendant's table. There sat Richard Landry, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the modest courtroom. His smug expression and whispered exchanges with his attorney spoke volumes. He exuded the kind of confidence that came from years of getting away with things, and Ayanna felt a familiar spark of defiance ignite within her. The proceedings began with opening statements, each side presenting their narrative. Layla's words were sharp, her arguments clear and precise. Landry's attorney, by contrast, leaned heavily on insinuations, framing the case as a baseless attack on his client's reputation. When it was Ayanna's turn to testify, she walked to the witness stand with steady steps. The room seemed to hold its breath as she raised her right hand, swearing the oath before taking her seat. Layla approached with a respectful nod, her questions carefully designed to draw out Ayanna's expertise. Ayanna explained the extent of Charles Carter's injuries, detailing how they aligned with the unsafe conditions reported at the construction site. Her words were calm and clinical, but the weight of their implications hung in the air. When it was Landry's attorney's turn to cross-examine, his approach was starkly different. He leaned against the podium, his tone conversational, but laced with a subtle edge. "Dr. Morgan," he began, "you've accomplished quite a bit in your career, haven't you?" "I've been fortunate to work in positions that allow me to make a difference," Ayanna replied evenly. "And yet, you've chosen to testify in this case. Why is that?" "Because the facts are clear," she said. "The injuries sustained by Mr. Carter were preventable, and they reflect negligence on the part of the contractor." "Negligence, you say?" the attorney mused. "Isn't it true that you've never visited the construction site in question?" "That's correct," Ayanna said. "But my analysis is based on the medical evidence, which speaks for itself." The attorney's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Medical evidence provided by the plaintiff's legal team. Isn't it possible that their interpretation might be biased?" Ayanna met his gaze without flinching. "Medical records don't have opinions. They only show facts." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, and the attorney's expression tightened. He pressed on, but Ayanna's calm, precise answers left him with little room to maneuver. When the cross-examination ended, she stepped down from the stand, her posture unshaken. As she returned to her seat, Ayanna couldn't help but notice the way Richard Landry avoided her gaze. For the first time, his smug confidence seemed to falter. The case recessed for the day, and Ayanna found herself standing outside the courthouse once more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps as she adjusted her satchel and began descending. She had barely reached the bottom when she heard a voice behind her. "Dr. Morgan." She turned to see a man in a gray suit approaching. His face was unfamiliar, but the intensity in his eyes sent a prickle of unease down her spine. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I'd like to offer you some advice. Greenwood isn't a place that takes kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." Ayanna's expression didn't waver. "I'm not here to stir up trouble, I'm here to speak the truth." The man's smile widened, but the coldness in his eyes deepened. "Just be careful, doctor. Some truths come with consequences." He turned and walked away, leaving Ayanna standing on the steps, her heart steady, but her resolve even stronger. Whatever was brewing in Greenwood, she wasn't backing down. Ayanna replayed the stranger's warning in her mind as she walked toward her car, her steps slow and deliberate. The sunlight was fading, casting a golden hue over the quiet streets of Greenwood. Though she maintained her composure outwardly, a storm brewed within her. The man's words were an unsettling reminder of the resistance she was bound to face in a town so deeply entrenched in its ways. She reached her car, unlocked the door, and slid inside, letting out a measured breath. Her phone buzzed in her bag, breaking the silence. Pulling it out, she saw a text from Rachel. "Everything okay? Call me when you can." Ayanna hesitated before typing a quick response. "I'm fine, we'll call later." She started the engine, the low hum grounding her. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A black SUV sat idling at the curb across the street, its tinted windows offering no clues about who was inside. It hadn't been there earlier, she was sure of it. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to focus on the road ahead. Greenwood wasn't the kind of place where paranoia could afford to take root. If they wanted her intimidated, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The next morning, Ayanna arrived at the courthouse early, determined to focus on the task at hand. She had spent the night reviewing the case notes and medical evidence, mentally preparing herself for another day of testimony. As she entered the lobby, the now familiar Officer Grayson was stationed at the security checkpoint. This time, he greeted her with a smirk. "Back again, huh? Thought you'd be packing your bags after yesterday." Ayanna met his gaze with unwavering calm. "I don't scare that easily." Grayson chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "We'll see about that. Put your bag on the conveyor." She complied, stepping through the metal detector without incident. But as she reached for her belongings, Grayson held up her satchel, unzipping it without permission. "Routine check," he said, though his tone made it clear he was enjoying this little show of authority. He rummaged through the contents, his movements slow and deliberate, pulling out a neatly folded scarf and holding it up for inspection. "Find what you're looking for?" Ayanna asked, her voice steady, but firm. Grayson didn't answer. He stuffed the scarf back into the bag and handed it to her. "Just doing my job, doctor." Without a word, Ayanna took her bag and walked away. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing louder in her ears than the last. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavier than the day before. The proceedings had drawn a larger audience, including several local reporters and townspeople. Ayanna could feel their eyes on her as she took her seat near the front. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent current running between the rows of wooden benches. The morning session began with the defense calling a series of witnesses. Landry's attorney employed every tactic to discredit the claims of negligence, painting the incident as an unavoidable accident rather than a result of carelessness or bias. Ayanna listened closely, her jaw tightening as each statement twisted the facts to serve their narrative. During the break, Ayanna stepped outside to clear her head. The courthouse steps were bustling with activity, a mix of reporters, onlookers, and participants milling about. She leaned against the railing, the cool air a welcome reprieve from the stuffiness inside. "Dr. Morgan." The voice made her turn. A man in a crisp suit stood a few feet away, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Ayanna recognized him as Paul Landry, the brother of the defendant. His presence here was no coincidence. "Yes?" she said, her tone polite but cautious. "I wanted to introduce myself," Paul said, stepping closer. "I'm Paul Landry. My family owns the Landry Group. You've probably heard of us." "I have," Ayanna replied, offering nothing more. Paul's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I just thought we should talk, off the record." Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure what there is to discuss." "Oh, I think there's plenty," Paul said, lowering his voice. "You're a smart woman, Dr. Morgan. You've built quite a reputation for yourself. It would be a shame to see that tarnished by unnecessary entanglements." Ayanna's grip on the railing tightened, but her expression remained neutral. "If you're implying that my involvement in this case is anything other than professional, you're mistaken." Paul's smile faltered, and for a moment, his carefully composed demeanor cracked. "I'm implying that this town has its way of handling things. You're an outsider here. People don't take kindly to outsiders meddling in their affairs." Ayanna straightened, her eyes locking onto his. If advocating for the truth and standing up for someone's rights is considered meddling, then so be it. I didn't come here to make friends. Paul stepped back, his expression hardening. "You're making a mistake." "Perhaps," Ayanna said, "but it's mine to make." Paul lingered for a moment longer before walking away, his steps brisk and purposeful. Ayanna watched him disappear into the crowd, her pulse steady, but her resolve stronger than ever. The afternoon session brought its own set of challenges. During Ayanna's second round of testimony, Landry's attorney intensified his line of questioning, this time focusing on her credibility. "You're a surgeon, Dr. Morgan," he began. "Why involve yourself in a case like this? Surely your time is better spent in the operating room." "My time is best spent wherever it can make the most impact," Ayanna replied calmly. The attorney paced in front of the jury, his voice taking on a conversational tone. "But you're not from Greenwood, are you? You don't know its people, its culture, its industries. How can you possibly speak to the conditions here?" "I don't need to be from Greenwood to recognize negligence," Ayanna said. "The medical evidence is clear." The attorney smirked, turning to face her. "Isn't it true that your organization, the Morgan Health Initiative, relies on public goodwill and donations? Isn't it possible that your testimony here is an attempt to bolster your reputation, perhaps attract more donors?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Ayanna felt the heat of their stares. She took a steadying breath before answering. "My organization exists to provide healthcare to underserved communities," she said. "My testimony here has nothing to do with reputation and everything to do with justice." The attorney didn't look satisfied, but he moved on, unable to shake her composure. Ayanna sat through the rest of the session with her shoulders squared, her mind racing even as her exterior remained calm. When the day's proceedings ended, Ayanna exited the courthouse and headed toward her car. The black SUV from the day before was parked nearby, its engine idling. As she approached, the driver's side window rolled down, revealing the same man who had confronted her on the steps. "Doctor," he said, his tone smooth, but edged with menace. "We need to talk." Ayanna paused, her gaze unwavering. "I have nothing to say to you." The man's smile was thin and sharp. Then listen, Greenwood isn't like the cities you're used to. People here stick together, and they don't take kindly to outsiders stirring the pot. I'm not here to stir anything, Ayanna said. I'm here for the truth. Truth, the man echoed, his voice mocking. Funny thing about truth, it's not always welcome. Ayanna's grip on her bag tightened, but she didn't respond. The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You might want to think about how far you're willing to go with this, for your sake. Without another word, the window rolled up, and the SUV pulled away, leaving Ayanna standing in the fading light. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her expression remained calm. She wouldn't let them see her falter. Not now. Not ever. The courthouse parking lot was almost empty when Ayanna stepped outside, the late afternoon shadows stretching long across the pavement. The black SUV that had shadowed her for days was gone, but the absence felt more ominous than its presence. Her nerves were taut, her senses heightened, as if the air itself buzzed with unseen tension. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A text from Layla Harris, the plaintiff's attorney. Dr. Morgan, we need to talk. Urgent, meet me at Clarkson Diner, 6 p.m. Ayanna frowned. Layla had been composed and methodical throughout the case. This sudden urgency felt out of character. She quickly typed a reply. On my way. Clarkson Diner was one of Greenwood's few neutral zones, a modest establishment where townsfolk mingled without the pretense of formality. The bell above the door jingled as Ayanna stepped inside, scanning the booths until she spotted Layla in the back corner. Layla's usually sharp eyes were clouded, and her hands were clasped tightly around a mug of coffee. Ayanna slid into the seat across from her, setting her satchel beside her. What's going on? Ayanna asked, keeping her voice low. Layla glanced around the room before leaning in. I've been digging into the Landry Group's connections, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's worse than I thought. They've got half the town in their pocket. Judges, cops, even some of the media. This isn't just about a negligence case, Ayanna. This is a web of corruption, and they're desperate to keep it hidden. Ayanna's stomach tightened. What have you found? Layla slid a folder across the table. Ayanna opened it, her eyes scanning the pages of financial records, emails, and witness statements. Names leapt out at her. Officers, local officials, even prominent business leaders. It was a map of influence, each line connecting Landry to another piece of Greenwood's power structure. This is enough to blow the case wide open, Ayanna said. Layla's hands trembled slightly as she sipped her coffee. Maybe, but it's dangerous. They're already watching you. Ayanna. They know you're the strongest voice we have, and they'll do whatever it takes to silence you. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Ayanna's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. What do you suggest? Layla hesitated, her voice softening. Maybe it's time to step back. Let me handle this. Ayanna's eyes narrowed. Step back. You know that's not an option. Layla's gaze fell. I just don't want you to get hurt. I appreciate your concern, Ayanna said, her tone firm, but not unkind. But if we don't fight this, who will? Layla sighed, nodding reluctantly. Just be careful, okay? Ayanna slipped the folder into her satchel and stood. Always. The walk back to her car was uneventful, but as Ayanna reached the driver's side door, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Officer Daniels, a burly man with a square jaw and a smirk that radiated disdain. He leaned against the hood of a patrol car parked a few feet away. Evening, Doctor, he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. Ayanna's hand tightened on her keys, but her expression remained neutral. Officer Daniels, can I help you? Daniels pushed off the car and sauntered closer. You seem to be spending a lot of time stirring things up around here, not a great look for someone who doesn't belong. Ayanna squared her shoulders, her gaze steady. If you're referring to my role in the Carter case, I'm here to ensure the truth is heard. Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. The truth, huh? Funny thing about the truth. It can get people into trouble. You might want to think about that. Ayanna's jaw clenched, but she refused to rise to the bait. Is there a reason you're stopping me, officer? Or are you just wasting my time? Daniels's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Watch your tone, doctor wouldn't want to escalate things." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his patrol car. Ayanna climbed into her own vehicle, her hands trembling slightly, as she gripped the steering wheel. Daniels's words weren't just a warning, they were a promise. The next morning, Ayanna arrived at the courthouse to find the atmosphere unusually tense. Groups of people huddled together, whispering in hushed tones. Reporters hovered near the entrance, their cameras aimed at the doors as if expecting a spectacle. As Ayanna stepped inside, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. Grayson was manning the security checkpoint again, but this time, his expression was smug, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Dr. Morgan," he drawled, "we've got some new procedures today. Need you to come with me." Ayanna's heart sank, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Why, what's this about?" Grayson's smirk widened. "Just following protocol, let's go." She followed him down a narrow hallway that led to a small windowless room. Inside, 2 other officers waited, their postures tense. On the table between them sat her satchel, its contents spilled out in disarray. Ayanna's pulse quickened. "What is this?" Grayson stepped forward, holding up a small plastic bag containing a white powdery substance. "Found this in your bag during routine screening, care to explain?" Shock rippled through her. "That's impossible, you planted that." Grayson's grin turned predatory. "Now why would I do a thing like that?" Ayanna's mind raced. This was retaliation, plain and simple, a calculated move to discredit her and derail the case. She straightened, her voice sharp and unwavering. "I want my attorney." Grayson shrugged. "Of course, doctor, but until then, you're coming with us." The officers closed in, their hands gripping her arms as they cuffed her wrists. Ayanna didn't resist, though every fiber of her being screamed to fight. As they led her out of the room and into the main lobby, the flash of cameras and the murmurs of the crowd hit her like a wave. "Dr. Morgan, do you have a comment? What's your connection to the Carter case? Is this arrest politically motivated?" Ayanna kept her head high, refusing to let the spectacle break her. This was exactly what they wanted. To see her falter, to make her small, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Hours later, Ayanna sat in a dimly lit holding cell, her back against the cold cinderblock wall. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each detail sharpening her resolve. They had tried to humiliate her, to silence her, but all they had done was reveal their desperation. A clanging noise drew her attention. The cell door creaked open, and Layla stepped inside, her expression a mix of anger and relief. "Are you okay?" Layla asked. Ayanna nodded. "They're scared, Layla. That's why they did this." Layla sat down beside her. "It's all over the news, people are already questioning the timing, the charges. This might backfire on them." "It has to," Ayanna said, her voice firm. "We can't let them get away with this." Layla hesitated before handing Ayanna her phone. "There's something else, that folder you showed me. It's gone. Someone broke into my office." Ayanna's stomach sank. "Did you make copies?" Layla nodded. "I have backups, but we need to act fast. If they're willing to go this far, they won't stop." Ayanna's eyes burned with determination. "Then we take the fight to them." Ayanna sat in the back of the patrol car, her wrists bound in cold, unyielding steel. The fluorescent streetlights outside cast long shadows, slicing through the dark interior of the car. The humiliation of her public arrest burned hot in her chest, but it was overshadowed by something stronger. Resolve. This was a move meant to break her, to strip her of dignity, but they had underestimated her strength. Through the tinted glass, Ayanna could see the courthouse steps swarming with reporters. Flashing cameras captured every humiliating moment as Officer Daniels led her out in cuffs, his grip firm but unnecessary. Ayanna refused to bow her head or hide her face. She walked with purpose, her gaze locked ahead. At the edge of the crowd, she spotted Mitchell, the young reporter she had spoken to earlier in the week. His expression was a mixture of shock and anger, and she could see him furiously scribbling notes. Their eyes met for a brief moment before she was pushed into the car. Inside the station, Ayanna was processed with efficiency that felt disturbingly rehearsed. Her personal belongings were taken, her mugshot snapped, and she was led to a small interrogation room. Officer Daniels was waiting, leaning casually against the table, his smirk now a full-blown grin. "Quite the spectacle out there, Doctor," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You're really making a name for yourself in Greenwood." Ayanna sat down across from him, her posture as composed as ever. "If this is your idea of intimidation, you're wasting your time." Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you, walking into this town like some savior, thinking you can expose what you don't understand?" "I understand perfectly," Ayanna said, her voice sharp. "You and your friends thrive on fear and silence, but silence doesn't mean compliance." Daniel's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of anger. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You think you're clever, but you don't know how deep this goes. Walk away while you still can." Ayanna met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "If you think arresting me on false charges will make me back down, you've made a serious miscalculation." Before Daniels could respond, the door opened, and Layla Harris stepped inside, her presence commanding. "That's enough," she said, her voice icy. "Dr. Morgan has a right to counsel, and this interrogation is over." Daniels straightened, his smirk returning. "Of course I'll leave you to it." He sauntered out of the room, but not before throwing Ayanna one last pointed look. As the door clicked shut, Layla sat down across from Ayanna, her expression tight with concern. "Are you okay?" Ayanna nodded. "This was planned. They're escalating because they know we're getting too close." Layla sighed, rubbing her temples. "The charges are flimsy at best, but that doesn't matter to them. The goal was to humiliate you, to discredit you in the public eye." "Then we need to push back," Ayanna said firmly. "Did you secure the backups of the files?" "Yes," Layla replied. "But we have another problem. The judge assigned to your arraignment is on Landry's payroll. They'll try to keep you in custody as long as they can." Ayanna leaned forward, her mind racing. "We need to get ahead of this, release the evidence to the press. Everything. If we wait, they'll bury it." Layla hesitated. "That's risky. Once it's out there, there's no turning back." "Exactly," Ayanna said. "This fight isn't just about me, it's about exposing the entire system. We can't play it safe anymore." Layla studied her for a moment before nodding. "I'll make the calls, but you need to be prepared for what comes next." "I already am," Ayanna said, her voice steady. Hours later, Ayanna was released on bail, the courthouse steps once again a battlefield of flashing cameras and shouted questions. She stood beside Layla, her head held high, as Mitchell pushed through the crowd to reach her. "Dr. Morgan," he said, his voice urgent. "What happened today was a blatant abuse of power. Do you have a statement?" Ayanna glanced at Layla, who gave a small nod. Turning back to Mitchell, she spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This arrest was an attempt to silence me, to undermine the truth. But let me be clear. I will not be intimidated, and I will not back down. The people of Greenwood deserve justice, and I intend to see that they get it." Mitchell's pen moved furiously across his notebook as the crowd buzzed with renewed energy. Ayanna and Layla pushed through the throng, making their way to a waiting car. That evening, in a dimly lit conference room, Ayanna, Layla, and Mitchell gathered to finalize their strategy. The room was cluttered with papers, laptops, and a projector displaying the damning evidence against the Landry Group. "This is enough to blow their operation wide open," Mitchell said, his voice filled with awe and determination. "But releasing this will put a target on all of us." "They already have us in their sights," Ayanna said. "The difference is now, we have the power to fight back." Layla tapped a few keys on her laptop, bringing up a list of media contacts. "Once we send this out, the story will go national. Landry won't be able to control the narrative." "But we need to ensure the evidence is secure," Ayanna added. "If they can discredit or tamper with it, we lose everything." Mitchell nodded. "I have a few trusted contacts who can help disseminate this to multiple outlets at once. Redundancy is key." As they worked late into the night, a sense of unity formed between them. They were no longer individuals fighting separate battles. They were a team, united by a shared purpose. The next morning, Ayanna woke to a barrage of notifications. The story had broken headlines, screamed of corruption, abuse of power, and the Landry Group's insidious influence over Greenwood news outlets, aired clips of Ayanna's arrest alongside the leaked evidence, and social media erupted with outrage. But the victory was short-lived. As Ayanna prepared to leave her apartment, her phone buzzed with an anonymous text. "You've gone too far, leave town, or you'll regret it." Ayanna's jaw tightened. She showed the message to Layla, who had arrived moments earlier. "This is their next move," Ayanna said. "Intimidation." "Let them try," Layla replied. "We're not stopping now." Outside the courthouse later that day, a crowd had gathered. Supporters held signs demanding justice, while detractors shouted insults and accusations. Ayanna stood on the steps, flanked by Layla and Mitchell, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. As she approached the podium, she scanned the faces in the crowd, spotting Officer Daniels lurking near the edge, his expression dark and unreadable. Nearby, Paul Landry stood with his arms crossed, his cold glare aimed directly at her. Ayanna gripped the edges of the podium and spoke into the microphone, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Greenwood is at a crossroads," she began. "This is a moment for accountability, for change. The truth is out, and it cannot be silenced. To those who think they can intimidate me or anyone else into submission, hear this: we will not back down." The crowd erupted, some cheering, others jeering, but Ayanna stood firm. She had thrown down the gauntlet, and the next move was theirs. Cliffhanger, setup. As Ayanna descended the steps, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her blood running cold. "We're watching." She looked up, scanning the faces in the crowd, but saw no immediate threat. The message was clear. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had just risen. The air inside the Greenwood Community Hall was electric with tension. The crowd gathered for the emergency town meeting was larger than expected. A mix of supporters, skeptics, and those just curious to witness the showdown. Ayanna stood on the small stage, her shoulders back and her chin high. Beside her, Layla quietly handed out copies of the evidence they had painstakingly compiled. On a large screen behind them, damning emails, financial records, and images of land deals signed off by Paul Landry scrolled in a slow, damning loop. The front row was occupied by a collection of city officials, their expressions ranging from stony to visibly agitated. Paul Landry sat at the center, his arms crossed and his lips curled into a faint sneer. Officer Daniels stood behind him, his uniform immaculate, but his eyes cold and calculating. Ayanna could feel his gaze burning into her, as she adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable edge. "This town has been manipulated, deceived, and harmed by those who were meant to protect and serve it. Tonight, we're not just talking about accountability, we're demanding it." A murmur rippled through the room, some nodding in agreement while others crossed their arms, their skepticism evident. The turning point. Paul Landry rose to his feet, his movement slow and deliberate, drawing the room's attention like a stage actor commanding his audience. "Dr. Morgan," he said, his voice smooth but dripping with condescension, "while I admire your dedication to theatrics, your accusations are baseless. You've dragged my name, and this town's good officers, through the mud with half-baked evidence and sensationalism." Ayanna stepped closer to the microphone, her eyes narrowing. "Baseless? Then perhaps you can explain these financial records," she said, gesturing to the screen behind her. A graph highlighted a series of suspicious transfers between Landry's accounts and shell corporations linked to Greenwood's redevelopment fund. "This money was meant to support community projects, yet it disappeared into your pockets." The crowd gasped, whispers breaking out among the attendees. Landry's expression hardened, the smirk slipping for the briefest moment. "You don't understand the complexities of local governance," Landry countered, his voice rising slightly. "This is nothing more than a smear campaign by an outsider who doesn't belong here." Ayanna clenched the edge of the podium. "What I understand, Mr. Landry, is corruption. And I understand exactly how far you've gone to silence anyone who dared to challenge your hold over this town. But your time is up." Before Landry could respond, Officer Daniels stepped forward, his posture radiating authority. "Enough of this circus!" he barked. "You're out of line, Dr. Morgan. I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction and incitement." The room erupted in chaos. With shouts and gasps filling the air, Ayanna didn't flinch. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Daniels approached the stage, his hand resting ominously on the holster at his hip. "You've caused nothing but disorder since you arrived here. You're undermining public safety, and I won't stand for it." Ayanna held his gaze, unyielding. "Public safety? You mean the safety of your reputation, Officer Daniels? Your threats won't work this time." Daniels climbed the steps to the stage, his face inches from hers now. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You should have walked away when you had the chance." Ayanna leaned closer, her voice steady but laced with defiance. "You're right where I want you." The revelation. From the back of the hall, Mitchell, the reporter, shouted, "Check the feed!" The room's attention shifted as Layla activated a second screen. A live broadcast from a local news station appeared, showing a hidden camera recording from earlier that week. In the grainy footage, Officer Daniels could be seen meeting with Landry in his office. Their voices were low, but clear enough to hear. "We'll deal with Morgan," Daniels said, his tone cold. "A few scares, maybe a night in the cells, and she'll fold, they always do." Landry nodded. "Make sure of it. If she doesn't back down, we'll escalate. No one cares about a little noise in Greenwood." The crowd erupted again. This time with outrage, Daniels turned sharply toward the screen, his face going pale as he realized what had just been exposed. This is a setup," he shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. Ayanna stepped back to the microphone. "That's who you're protecting. That's who you're defending when you call me the problem. This isn't just about me. It's about every person this town has sacrificed for power and profit." Landry, now visibly sweating, tried to interject. "This is an invasion of privacy. You have no right." "No right?" Ayanna cut him off. "You've used fear, violence, and lies to keep this town under your thumb. You've betrayed the very people who trusted you." Protagonists resolve. Daniels reached for his radio, his hand trembling as he barked into it. "I need backup at Community Hall, immediately." Ayanna turned to face him, her voice sharp. "Backup won't save you now, Daniels. This isn't your courtroom, and it's not your interrogation room. This is the truth, and everyone here sees it." For the first time, Daniels seemed at a loss for words. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. The crowd, once split, was now firmly on Ayanna's side, their anger directed squarely at the two men on the stage. As murmurs turned into chants of, "Justice, justice," Ayanna turned to the people. "This fight doesn't end tonight. It ends when we dismantle the systems that allowed this to happen. It ends when every voice in Greenwood is heard." High stakes, the cliffhanger. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the hall burst open, and a squad of uniformed officers entered, their presence silencing the room. At their helm was Chief Connolly, a stern-faced man who had largely stayed out of the fray until now. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the chaos, the evidence on the screen, and the simmering fury of the crowd. "Stand down," he barked at Daniels, who froze mid-step. "What?" Daniels sputtered. "Chief, I said stand down," Connolly repeated, his tone brooking no argument. He turned to Ayanna, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Morgan, I suggest you and your team come with me. We need to talk, privately." The tension in the room was suffocating as Ayanna hesitated, weighing her options. The crowd's chants grew louder, their anger palpable. She glanced at Layla, who nodded subtly. This was a risk, but it might be the only way to push forward. With a deep breath, Ayanna stepped off the stage and followed Connolly toward the door. Daniels watched her go, his fists clenched and his face twisted with rage. As she passed him, Ayanna paused just long enough to whisper, "Your time is up." The hall erupted once more as the doors closed behind her, leaving the crowd, the evidence, and the exposed corruption as a powder keg ready to ignite. The tension in Chief Connolly's office was palpable. Ayanna sat across from him, her shoulders squared and gaze unwavering. Behind her, Layla stood silently, her expression a mix of determination and apprehension. Chief Connolly leaned forward, his hands steepled on his desk, while Officer Daniels paced in the corner, his anger barely contained. "You're playing with fire, Dr. Morgan," Connolly began, his voice low and deliberate. Do you have any idea what you've started? Ayanna met his gaze without flinching. What I've started is exposing the truth. What you've started, Chief, is a legacy of corruption and fear that ends now. Daniel slammed his fist against the wall, causing Layla to flinch. This is nonsense. She has no authority here, no jurisdiction, no credibility. She's an outsider stirring up trouble. Ayanna turned to him, her voice calm but cutting. The truth isn't confined to jurisdictions, Officer Daniels, and neither is justice. Daniels glared at her, his face red with fury. You think you're untouchable because you've got a few papers and some doctored footage you don't know who you're dealing with. Connolly held up a hand, silencing Daniels. Enough. This situation has already spiraled out of control. We need to de-escalate before it gets worse. De-escalate? Ayanna repeated, incredulous. The only thing escalating is the accountability this town has been avoiding for years. You can't sweep this under the rug anymore. Connolly sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. You don't understand the full picture, Dr. Morgan. There's more at play here than you realize. The revelation. Ayanna's eyes narrowed. Then why don't you enlighten me, Chief? For a moment, Connolly hesitated, his jaw tightening. Landry isn't just some crooked politician, he has ties, powerful ones, developers, state officials, even some federal connections. If you think you're going to bring him down without consequences, you're mistaken. Ayanna leaned forward, her voice firm. So you've chosen to protect him instead of the people you swore to serve. It's not that simple, Connolly snapped, his composure cracking. Do you think I want this? Do you think I like watching this town rot from the inside out? I've been fighting to hold things together. Daniels sneered. You don't get it, do you? Greenwood doesn't need saving, it needs control. People like you think you can walk in here and dictate how we do things, but you don't belong. You never did. Ayanna stood slowly, her presence commanding. What you mean, Officer Daniels, is that people like me disrupt your comfort. You've built an empire on the backs of this town's most vulnerable, and you think your badge makes you invincible. It doesn't. Daniels took a step toward her, his fists clenched. You're awfully brave for someone standing alone. Alone? Ayanna's voice rang with defiance. Turn on the news, Daniels. The world is watching, you're not in control anymore. Layla reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, holding it up to display a live feed. The video showed a growing crowd outside the station, holding signs and chanting. Journalists were setting up cameras, their microphones catching every chant of "Justice for Greenwood." Daniels froze, his face twisting with panic. What the hell is this? Protagonist's strength. Ayanna stepped closer to him, her voice low but powerful. That's accountability knocking at your door. Every lie, every abuse of power, every life you've destroyed. It's all out there now, you can't hide anymore. Daniel's bravado faltered, but he quickly masked it with anger. You think a mob of protesters scares me? They're nothing. They're everything, Ayanna countered. Because they represent the truth you've been running from, and they won't stop until you're held accountable. Connolly rubbed his temples, clearly torn. This isn't how we fix things, he muttered. You're creating chaos. No, Ayanna corrected. I'm exposing the chaos you allowed to fester. If you truly care about this town, you'll stop protecting the guilty and start standing for what's right. Daniels laughed bitterly. And what happens when they turn on you, Morgan? When the system chews you up and spits you out? Do you think they'll still be chanting your name? Ayanna didn't hesitate. I don't care if they do. This isn't about me. It's about every person you've silenced and every life you've ruined. You'll answer for what you've done. The high stakes. The door to Connolly's office burst open, and a young officer entered, his face pale. Chief, the crowd outside is getting restless. They're demanding answers. Connolly cursed under his breath. Damn it, Daniels. Get out there and... I'll go. Ayanna interrupted, her voice steady. She turned to Layla. Stay here and keep documenting everything. If anything happens to me, make sure it gets out. Layla's eyes widened. Ayanna. Trust me, Ayanna said firmly. She glanced at Connolly. You can either join me or stay in here and watch this town burn. Reluctantly, Connolly stood. Fine, let's go. The cliffhanger. Outside, the crowd had swelled, their chants echoing through the night. Ayanna stepped onto the station's front steps, her presence commanding immediate attention. Cameras turned to her, and the chants quieted as the crowd waited to hear her speak. Ayanna raised her hands, her voice clear and resolute. "People of Greenwood, tonight we take a stand. No more lies, no more corruption. This is our town, and we demand justice." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy palpable. But as Ayanna looked out over the sea of faces, she noticed movement at the edges. Black SUVs pulled up, and men in suits stepped out, their expressions cold and unreadable. Layla's voice crackled through Ayanna's earpiece. "Ayanna, those aren't reporters. Be careful." Ayanna's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. Turning to Connolly, she said, "This is your moment, Chief. Do what's right." Connolly hesitated, his internal conflict etched across his face. But before he could respond, one of the suited men approached the steps, a phone in his hand. "You're making a mistake, Dr. Morgan," the man said, his voice calm but threatening. "You have no idea who you're up against." Ayanna stepped forward, her voice steady. "Neither do you." The tension was suffocating, the crowd buzzing with uncertainty. Ayanna's heart pounded, but she stood her ground, ready for whatever came next. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The crowd outside the Greenwood police station swelled, their chants echoing into the cold night. Ayanna stood tall on the steps, her resolve unshaken despite the palpable tension. The men from the black SUVs remained at the perimeter, their calculated movements suggesting they were waiting for the right moment to act. Officer Daniels lingered in the doorway, his posture defensive, his eyes darting between Ayanna, the crowd, and Chief Connolly. Chief Connolly cleared his throat, stepping up beside Ayanna. He scanned the crowd, his face heavy with the weight of his decision. "People of Greenwood," he began, his voice strained but steady. "You have a right to demand accountability." The crowd quieted slightly, their focus shifting to Connolly. Daniels looked at him, stunned. "Chief, what are you—" Connolly silenced him with a sharp glare. "It's over, Daniels. No more cover-ups, no more lies." Ayanna turned to Connolly, her expression a mix of relief and cautious optimism. She could see the internal battle he had fought and recognized the courage it took to make this stand. Conflict resolution. As Connolly spoke, several officers emerged from the station, their faces unreadable. Among them was Layla, her phone still recording, her expression one of determination. She nodded at Ayanna, signaling that everything was being documented. One of the suited men approached the steps, his voice cold and commanding. "Chief Connolly, this is a mistake. You don't want to go down this road." Connolly stepped forward, his stance firm. "The mistake was letting this go on for so long. Dr. Morgan was right. Our job is to protect the people, not to protect ourselves." The man smirked, pulling out a phone. "Do you really think this changes anything? We have the resources to bury all of this." Ayanna stepped forward, her voice ringing with authority. "Not this time. The world is watching, and the truth is already out there. You can't bury what everyone already knows." The man's smirk faltered as he glanced at the crowd. Reporters with cameras and microphones were pushing closer, capturing every word. A ripple of unease spread through his team. Accountability and justice. At that moment, a convoy of cars pulled up, their lights flashing. Federal agents stepped out, led by a woman in a sharp suit. She moved with purpose, her badge gleaming under the streetlights. "Agent Sullivan, FBI," she announced. "We've received credible reports of corruption and misconduct within the Greenwood Police Department." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a crescendo of triumph. Agent Sullivan approached the steps, addressing Connolly. "Chief, we'll need access to all records and personnel files immediately." Connolly nodded, his relief evident. "You'll have full cooperation." Daniels stepped back, his face pale. "This is a setup. You can't do this to me." He turned to the suited man. "You said you'd protect us." The man's expression hardened. "You're on your own, Daniels." As Daniels began to protest, two federal agents moved in, placing him under arrest. "Bradley Daniels, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and abuse of power," one agent stated as they cuffed him. Daniels struggled, shouting obscenities, but his words were drowned out by the cheers of the crowd. Ayanna watched as he was led away, her heart heavy but resolute. Justice was finally being served, but the cost had been high. Protagonist's growth. Ayanna took a deep breath, the weight of the night settling over her. She had faced insurmountable odds, stood against a corrupt system, and emerged victorious. Yet, she knew this was only the beginning. Layla approached her, her voice soft but steady. "You did it. They're listening now." Ayanna nodded, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "We did it, and now we have to make sure it sticks." Chief Connolly walked over, his expression one of gratitude mixed with regret. "Dr. Morgan, I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up sooner." "You're speaking up now," Ayanna replied. "That's what matters." Connolly extended his hand, and Ayanna shook it firmly. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized a shift, one man choosing to stand on the right side of history. Systemic change. In the days that followed, Greenwood underwent a transformation. The federal investigation uncovered a web of corruption that extended beyond the police department. Developers, local officials, and even state representatives were implicated, leading to a wave of arrests and resignations. The people of Greenwood began to reclaim their town. Community leaders stepped up, organizing forums and workshops to address the systemic issues that had plagued the area for decades. Ayanna played a pivotal role, using her platform and resources to advocate for reform. Layla's footage became a key piece of evidence, circulating widely on social media and news outlets. It sparked national conversations about accountability and the power of grassroots movements. Emotional closure. One evening, Ayanna found herself back at the clinic. The building was still in disarray, the damage from the fire yet to be repaired. She stood in the empty hallway, her footsteps echoing softly. Despite the challenges ahead, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Layla appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You okay?" she asked, handing one to Ayanna. Ayanna took the cup, nodding. "I am. For the first time in a long time, I really am." Layla smiled. "Good, because we've got a lot of work to do." Ayanna chuckled softly. "We do. But now we're not doing it alone." Setting up future possibilities. As Ayanna stepped outside, she was met with a group of community members waiting to speak with her. Among them were local activists, business owners, and young leaders inspired by her courage. One man stepped forward, his voice steady. "Dr. Morgan, we're ready to fight for this town. Just tell us what we need to do." Ayanna smiled, her heart swelling with hope. "We start by rebuilding, together." As the group began to discuss plans, Ayanna's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen to see a message from Agent Sullivan. "New developments, call me ASAP." Ayanna's smile faded slightly, but her resolve remained. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Turning back to the group, she said, "Let's get to work." The quiet hum of the evening surrounded Ayanna as she stood on the newly repaired steps of the Greenwood Community Health Center. The scars of the fire were gone, replaced with fresh paint and reinforced walls. But the journey to this moment was etched deeply in her mind. The events of the past weeks had left their mark. On her, on Greenwood, and on everyone who had witnessed the fight for justice. She glanced out at the street, now alive with the sounds of hope and renewal. Where fear and tension had once lingered, there was now a cautious optimism. Families strolled, community leaders spoke with renewed purpose, and volunteers worked tirelessly to rebuild not just structures, but trust and unity. It was a new beginning, but Ayanna knew that the road ahead would still be fraught with challenges. Ayanna's growth and resilience. For Ayanna, the ordeal had been a crucible, a test of her resolve and her belief in the power of standing firm against injustice. When she first arrived in Greenwood, her focus had been singular: establish a health center that could serve the community's most vulnerable. She hadn't anticipated the resistance, the corruption, or the outright hostility, but she also hadn't anticipated the strength she would find, not just within herself, but in the people who rallied behind her. Ayanna had learned that fighting for justice wasn't about grand gestures or instant victories. It was about persistence, about refusing to be silenced even when the odds seemed insurmountable. She had faced humiliation, threats, and danger, But each setback had only deepened her determination. Standing on those steps now, she felt a profound sense of purpose. She was no longer just a surgeon or a philanthropist. She was a catalyst for change. The ripple effect, broader implications. The events in Greenwood had exposed more than just a corrupt police department. They had laid bare the systemic issues that allowed such corruption to thrive. The collusion between officers like Daniels and developers like Harrington was not unique to this town. It was a microcosm of the systemic racism and abuse of power that plagued communities across the nation. The footage of Daniels' arrest and the FBI investigation had gone viral, sparking conversations far beyond Greenwood news outlets, dissected the intricate web of corruption, while advocacy groups seized the moment to push for reform. Ayanna's story had become a rallying cry for others facing similar struggles, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be challenged. But Ayanna was acutely aware that the fight didn't end with exposing the truth. True change required more than just outrage. It required sustained effort, education, and a commitment to justice. She had seen firsthand how fear and complacency allowed injustice to persist. Now, she was determined to use her platform to ensure that the momentum from Greenwood's transformation wasn't lost. A call to action. As Ayanna reflected on the journey, she knew the most important lesson was this: no one could fight alone. It was the collective voices of the community, the courage of allies like Layla, and the eventual stand of figures like Chief Connolly that had made victory possible. Ayanna believed in the power of one person to spark change, but she also understood the necessity of solidarity. Standing on the steps, she addressed a small gathering of community members and activists who had come to discuss the next steps. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through the storm and emerged stronger. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she began, her tone steady and impassioned. "It takes time, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. What we've done here in Greenwood is just the beginning. There are still those who will try to hold us back, who will say that what we're fighting for isn't possible. But we've proven them wrong." She paused, scanning the crowd. This isn't just about one town or one system. It's about the world we want to leave for the next generation. We have a responsibility, not just to speak up when we see injustice, but to act, to stand together and make it clear that we will not go back to the way things were. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Ayanna knew the true test would be what came next. Would the people of Greenwood carry this momentum forward? Would they continue to demand accountability and push for systemic reform? She believed they would, but she also knew it was her responsibility to lead by example. Emotional closure. That night, Ayanna returned to her modest apartment, the sounds of the town's revival still echoing in her ears. She sat by the window, looking out at the lights of the clinic across the street. Her phone buzzed with messages of gratitude, support, and requests for guidance. Each one reminded her that her fight had inspired others to find their own voices. As she sipped her tea, a sense of peace settled over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from the absence of conflict. There were still battles to be fought, still injustices to confront. But it was the peace of knowing she had stayed true to her values, that she had made a difference, no matter how small. She opened her laptop and began drafting a plan for the next phase of the health center's expansion. It would include not only medical services, but also educational programs, legal aid, and a space for community organizing. It was ambitious, but Ayanna had learned to dream big. After all, Greenwood's transformation had started with a single idea and the determination to see it through. A message of hope. The story of Ayanna Morgan and Greenwood was not one of unbroken triumph. It was a story of struggle, setbacks, and imperfect progress. But it was also a story of resilience, of ordinary people refusing to accept the status quo, and of the extraordinary power that comes from standing together. For those who watched Ayanna's journey unfold, the message was clear: the fight for justice is never easy, but it is always worth it. Change might be slow, and the obstacles might seem insurmountable, but every step forward matters. To the audience, Ayanna's story posed a challenge. Where do you stand in the face of injustice? Will you speak up, even when it's uncomfortable? Will you act, even when it feels like your voice is small? Because, as Greenwood had shown, Even the smallest voices could create ripples that turned into waves. As Ayanna closed her laptop and prepared for bed, she felt the weight of her journey lift, replaced by the hope of what was still to come. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for it. And as she drifted off to sleep, the lights of Greenwood's streets burned brightly, a beacon of the change that was possible when people refused to give up.